I'm Ethan Wong, the 2020 National Student Poet of the Southwest, and I'm talking today with Haydil Henriquez. Towards the end of this interview, there will be a reading of a specially selected poem, so stick around for that.
Hi, everyone. My name is Haydil Henriquez. I am a poet from the Bronx, New York. I'm also a Scholastic Awards alumni. I received a gold key and gold medal in 2008 for my poetry. And ever since, I've been continuing my craft. I am now the New York City Scholastic Awards manager, and I'm honored to be serving that role. I continue to write poetry. I actually completed the Emerging Poets Fellowship at Poets House in 2018. Have been continuing working on my collection and have just been honored the Bronx Poet Laureate position, which is the first ever position or first ever poet to have ever served this role. So I'm really excited. And I'm even more excited to share some of my learnings and my journey with you all.
Thank you, that's amazing. Just to get started, I think this is a question I think I've heard in almost every interview with a poet probably, but a lot of the trouble with any field is starting, so it's like obligatory at this point to ask, how did you start, right?
This is a great question. I will say I started writing mainly in middle school and high school. I distinctly remember in 8th grade having poetry projects, and I was very reluctant to write. I felt like at the time it was very stupid and inaccessible. It just didn't feel like it really told the story of me. But later on, I had really great educators that related poetry to kind of my life and my experiences. Like I mentioned, I'm from the Bronx. So when I was able to see poetry as like rap and see its many different forms, I was able to put myself in those lines, in those line breaks. Um, and I felt like I was beginning to really tell the story of me. So once I got into high school, I joined a spoken word team. And that's really when I began flying. I think all young people need an outlet, a platform, a space to express themselves. We're going through so many changes, not only in our bodies, but our minds, our world around us, that it's important to have a place, a brave and safe space to express those changes. So through spoken word, I was able to kind of develop my voice further. I will also say I had a very heavy accent. I am a first generation American, and English was my second language. So spoken word and poetry became the tool for me to develop my language further, let go of some of my fears, because there's a lot of fears speaking up when English isn't your first language. But also, like, it became a pathway for me for liberation, for expression. Um, yeah, I felt like I really began flying when I was introduced to spoken word poetry, and then it began changing. So I always tell folks, be open to your poetry transforming over the years.
Yeah, I definitely agree with a lot of what you said there. I wanted to touch on a specific point, which is this idea about poetry being as a way to express yourself, to like be a safe space, or to be a almost like release point for all of this tension that you have built up all the time. Like when you're talking about those specific things, what kind of like personally emotions would you be releasing, or what kind of tensions do you think were building up that you had to get out?
Yeah, anger, like a lot of anger, a lot of angst. I think as a child, or as a young person, I was still trying to understand the world around me. And there were just so many injustices in my eyes, right? And for me, an injustice was like the SAT. I was like, what is this? Like, like, why do we need to take this exam? But then those injustices evolved to much deeper issues, like the justice system or police brutality and issues around immigration. So I think as I was developing my sense of self and my sense of purpose in this world, it was really important to have poetry as a medium to kind of share with myself how I had evolved, but also to like share with others, right? Because the beauty about poetry is that you can decide to keep it for yourself, um, and that's completely okay. But you can also decide to share with others so that others can have a piece of you, right? It's really a page, a script, a synopsis, a video clip of your life when someone reads your poetry.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, and I'm sure you could see me like vigorously nodding my head. But like, there's so many poems that I like write, and then I realize I'm like, I don't even know. It's not even that I think it's like particularly bad or I didn't not proud of the piece. It's just like I don't know if I really need to share it. I just feel like having written it is enough. I feel like it's out there somewhere, right?
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to like kind of follow up on that. I definitely like the way you talk about how poetry serves like political conscience, especially like coming in because when you're in middle school and high school, that's a lot of where you develop not just your sense of self, I'd say, is like as person, but like how you think your beliefs fit in with the world, right? So I wanted you to like ask on that. So when you're telling those kinds of like messages, how do you incorporate them into like stories? Because a lot of times I feel like poetry, you're always somehow telling a story, right?
Yeah, that's great. I will say a lot of poets have a hard time with this, right? Because you want to incorporate as many details as possible. But for example, if you're writing a poem about like a playground bully, right? You probably don't want to write their name, right? Or you probably want to show the playground bully in a metaphoric way, right? So I think for me it's important to get to the root, the essence, right, of what you're trying to say, and come up with as many words as possible, right, that talk about that. So that way you have a word bank, you have like a bunch of different words you can go back to if you're ever feeling stuck, right? And then you try to kind of write what you're trying to say as simply as possible. And then you go back to it and add all of the details and add all of the poetic language and technical terms, right? But when you start with kind of the essence of the topic, whether it's bullying or whether it is something much, much deeper, like talking about refugees or a political asylum, right? You want to get to like the root, the essence, right? And sometimes it comes in a very soft way. So maybe it's describing a tangerine first, and then you start talking about bully.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's just in that respect, I've seen so many poets do this where they latch onto current events and use that as a catalyst to write about these injustices, about these political issues, which I'm sure, and I can tell from like their previous work, they have long been following, right? So I think, what do you like in your experience? How have current events affected your poetry and how you end up writing about, or probably more likely, like what you end up writing about?
Yeah, this is a really great question because I think I was politicized very early. I my spoken word group that I was mentioning earlier. Every time we were writing, we would go through like newspaper clips and really inform ourselves about what was going on around the world before we started writing. Um, and I think then later on, there were a couple of themes that really spoke to me: identity, memory, home, belonging, that I feel like I often write about. And I think that's, I think my area, I'd say. I try to refrain, from writing about politics or things that don't necessarily impact me or my life or my loved ones. Because I don't know, I think a lot of people are afraid of imposter syndrome, but also I think for me, I really like to connect to my poetry because for me, it's a form of healing. Um, so I think if you approach it in that way, you are able to not only have a poem that expresses injustices in the world, but also have a poem that you can use as a healing tool to kind of address some of the traumas that to to be frank, traumas that you may be facing.
Yeah. I think I definitely know what you're talking about because I had this period where I was like, I don't even know if I want to write about like these current issues. Like I would feel the urge to write about them, but what ended up happening is that at first I thought it was because I was scared of like coming off as uninformed or like coming off as too heavily opinionated. But then I realized a big part of it is that if you can't like pinpoint exactly, or if it's too hard for you to pinpoint exactly where that impacts you as strong as you would like want to portray it as, then it's very difficult for you to like genuinely write the poem in a way that you feel proud of, in a way that you are able to express your opinions, and you think that you are like, I don't know, really putting yourself out there. You're just kind of putting something else out there almost, if that makes any sense.
No, yeah, that makes total sense. And I feel like, one of the things that you're talking about is like writing from the heart, right? Like
Yeah.
making sure that you're writing about things that really impact you, your community, your loved ones, your family, um, because that's really where there's a thing that poets say, duende, right? Which is kind of like the spirit comes out. There are a couple of poems that every time I read them, I cry, and I cannot stop crying, and I don't know why, but they're all about like very heavy grief. So I understand why I cry, but I always say I always want to go back to that kind of emotion when I'm writing.
Mm-hmm. And following off of that, I know we've talked a lot just now about how like all of these personal themes and all of these pieces of our identity can come together to form the body of what we write in our poetry. But I want to touch on another thing, which is for poets or prospective poets, I guess, who feel like their stories are too typical, as if like they are almost, I guess, enshrined in like this idea of I haven't had anything interesting happen to me. I don't think I've had enough like suffering in my life to even write. What do you think you would personally tell them about how they should start?
Yeah, don't write about suffering then. Write about joy. Write about your Tuesday afternoon, right? Write about the water. I think that's a beautiful question because I think I I love to read other poets, right? To learn other ways of writing, right? But I try not to have their writing influence my writing too much, right? Because I want it to show my authentic voice, right? And I think everyone is going through something, right? You're waking up every day, so that's something. You have an experience every day, so write about that, right? I don't think there's any harm in that. Sometimes I do like to write about something as simple as my TV monitor or my screen, right? But that poem may lead to many other poems. So never think that your life isn't enough or your life isn't extraordinary. It's extraordinary because you're in it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good answer, especially because now it's just I feel like the stigma that even then I almost kind of fell victim to, which is the idea that like if it's a good poem, it has to be about bad things, it has to be sad, it has to be all these different like separate little things, or else it's like doesn't fall in this very small box of good poems. But I think it just poetry can be so much more than that, and I definitely agree with your perspective there. Uh,
Yeah,
so
I'll just love to add that all great poets have a hard time writing at some point. So never allow that to hold you back.
And coming to that, actually, that actually leads pretty well into another question I had, which is, uh, how do you personally find material when you're at a standstill? Which is to say, like, you want to write and you know you want to write, but then you don't really know where to start.
Yeah. When I'm feeling stagnant, where I can't necessarily write, but I feel like I have the inclination, like I should be writing, I try to read, because I feel like maybe I just need to hold on to other words that aren't my own. I try to walk outside and see what's around me. I love this activity where you essentially just describe a bunch of ordinary things like your pen, right, or this like water bottle, right, and describe it to the fullest, right, just so that like any good well-oiled machine, right, I can get back into the habit of 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 putting the pen on the paper. Um, so I think those are some of the things that I do. But sometimes, like an offering that I'll give you all is um, don't write, right? If you're forcing yourself too much, right? Maybe it means that you should take some time meditating. You should take some time riding a bike. You should take some time talking, conversing with your parents or your elders or your friends so that you can gather more sound bites, so that you can gather more quotes, you can gather more insight that you could include into your writing.
Yeah, I think I really connected with the part where you're like talking about going out for a walk or going and riding your bike, because sometimes when I would have these periods of stagnance, or even I just like I might be like done with schoolwork and I'm just sitting there, I just go out for a walk, and then if it comes to me, if the urge to write comes to me, then it comes to me and I write. But if it doesn't, then at least I got a nice walk out of it.
Yeah. At least you exercised,
Yeah,
right?
right. And so I really, I was really interested in the point you brought up earlier, which is that when you're reading other poets' work, you want to take some words, but you want to take care to make sure it doesn't affect your own like voice too much, right? So then in that case, I'd like to like go further on that. How do you think your voice came about?
Yeah, I love this question because I've been grappling with the idea of authentic voice for a long time, right? Especially because um, we're in the like social media age. Like everyone has like a phone and everyone has an Instagram or Twitter or Facebook. And because of that, you're constantly fed information, right? That isn't yours necessarily. So I think one of the things that I try to do is go back and say, like, would 10-year-old Haydel understand this? Like, would 15-year-old Haydel understand this, right? Because sometimes I'm guilty of this, like in an effort to sound like, I don't know, smart and like professional and like profound and deep. You use these really big words that you don't really know what they mean. And then later on, you're like, wait, actually, like, I don't know if this even fits into this poem. So I try to go back and say, all right, how do I make it so that it feels like 10-year-old Haydel would read it and like still love it. 15-year-old Haydel would read it and still love it. So that I can really connect to that authentic voice still. I don't know if I answered your question, Ethan, or
No, I definitely I think this idea of authentic voice is also really interesting because it's really impossible to pinpoint for anyone. And I think there's almost a pressure to be like, oh, well, there's always this internal conflict where you're like, I don't know if it's authentic, or you'll be like, no matter what you've written, if I feel like I had this period where no matter what I wrote, I would compare it to something I had just recently read, and I'm like, what the? I just copied it, and I would be so concerned because I think I just subconsciously copied every single thing that I read. But I think it's really hard to exactly say, oh yeah, this is 100% me. So it's always like a blend of influences when it comes to that kind of stuff. in a way.
Yeah. I mean, I love that you mentioned this, right? Because it's so easy to compare our work to others' works, right? And I think we need to be okay with saying that was a work that I created when I was 14 years old, and it represents who I was at 14 years old, right? This is a work that I'm working on now, and it's evolving with me, right? But also thinking about this point uh, that you mentioned, Ethan, which is kind of like um, allow put yourself on the pedestal that you put other poets, right? Because it's so easy to say, "Oh my God, that poem is so dope! It's so cool! I love it! I want to write a poem just like it," right? But do the same for your poetry, right? Because for somebody else, when they're reading your poetry, they get that same kind of reaction. So it's important to put yourself at the same level that you put other poets.
So, having all of this experience and through all of this conversation, I can tell that you're very well versed and you definitely know what you're talking about. This is just kind of a more like, uh, not necessarily like an instructional question, but at which stage of your life do you think the most growth in your like poetic ability or like your poetic sense occurred?
For me personally, I think that I grew the most between like 16 and 21, I'd say. I was writing really deep work in high school, but when I headed off to college my freshman and sophomore year, I think that's really when I stepped into my voice further. I was learning a lot more, so I knew more about the world, but I also felt a lot more comfortable with who I was. And I think that's very natural. Like I think when you're a young person, it's very easy to like either be influenced by people around you or feel like you have to fit this mold. Unfortunately, high schools are still like that, where there's kind of like social hierarchies, and middle school sometimes too, and we all fall victim to that. And it wasn't until I kind of left that space that I was able to like sit down and say, no, this is my voice, and like this is how I like to express and write my poetry.
I think, yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty around this time, especially because you're still figuring out what you're even doing, and it's difficult to come up with a poetic voice that's firm in the same time that you don't feel like anything else in your life is really firm yet. So we talked earlier about there being a struggle for finding a story to write when you feel like writing. But that leads me to another question, which is, do you personally feel like when you write a poem, it comes from you needing to express a story, or does the story come from the poem, if that makes any sense?
Oh, I love that. I think a little bit of both. I think sometimes there are some poems that we hold on to in our bodies, whether it's because of some transition or some change in your family or in your community, or whether it's because, you just have a poem about love that you have to write, right? But then there are sometimes there are stories that are of course in your body, but then there's sometimes stories, and I think you mentioned this earlier, Ethan, that are created based on what's going on in the world around you. So for example, one of the poems that I'm going to share later, is it like an homage to rest in peace murals. Where I grew up, is very common on the sides of different buildings to have these huge murals dedicated to lost ones in the community. And usually it's someone from the neighborhood. Usually it's a young man. It's usually someone who might have lived a street life. um, but it's something that really informed my childhood. And one of my deepest fears as like gentrification evolves is that some of these like rest in peace murals are erased. And I've been seeing some of these murals being erased already. So I wrote a poem um, to kind of reflect on that. So, you know, sometimes there are, you see, poems that are in you, and then there's some poems that are kind of reflecting on what's going on around you, for me at least.
Yeah, it definitely varies from thing to thing. I think it can even be different for like two separate poems. One of them is a story I had to draw out from what I remembered, or another one might just be I realized it, it popped into my head, and then I had to write it. So I think it definitely varies. So for you, okay, so I remember what you said earlier about how sometimes you would take words in the effort to sound smart, you would like pick words that you didn't really know what they meant, or you might not really understood perfectly, or you didn't know if they fit, but you would then simplify them down. For you, I think, how much do you think wordplay comes into poetry? Because in my mind, there are two very big forces, or main forces, I'd say, of poetry, which is storytelling, probably, and wordplay. So, in your mind, which one is of more importance? Or if not, if you can't like rank them in importance, how do they interact for you?
Yeah, this is an amazing question. I love this question because I will say my poetry is very heavily informed by some of like my spoken word training from back in the day. So I actually really like the sounds of words. So I'm a big fan of alliteration. Like I just love a good set of alliteration in the beginning of a poem. But I also think that I think about like how the word falls out of your mouth, um, and more so than like what is the dictionary meaning. And then, of course, I had to go back and inform myself, like, what does this word actually mean, to make sure that what I am including in my poem makes sense. But I have like a word bank of words that I just love to use because of like how the sound rolls out of my tongue, like nostalgia. I love the word
Oh,
nostalgia. It's just such a great word. So I always invite folks to kind of play around with that. But at the end, please make sure you know what that word means. I think it is a good way to actually like expand your vocabulary and learn new words.
yeah. And I'll ask one last question and then we'll get into the reading. Just straight on, uh, before I had even touched poetry, besides like all the classics that you learn in like middle school, I had like a very overly cynical and bitter attitude towards modern poetry. Uh, like before any reading any of it, honestly. So, do you have any suggestions for reaching out to such people, or even talking to those people directly?
Yeah. So before I got into poetry, I thought that the only poets in the world were folks like Shakespeare and Edgar Allan Poe. And then I started looking for more poets who sounded like me, who looked like me, but also more modern poets who play with the form and break it down a little further. So never think that poetry needs to fit only one look. Poetry looks many different ways. And the beauty about like poetry, especially prose poetry, is that you can decide um, how it begins, how it ends, and all of the in-betweens. So don't feel like all your poems need to rhyme. Don't feel like all your poems need to have a word count or a sound count, right? Don't feel like all your poems need to fit this literary form. The best thing about poetry is the um, release of emotions, release of all these feelings that we often keep vented up.
I think it's the beautiful way to put it. All right, if you're ready.
Yeah, I am going to read a couple of poems in 1 second while I adjust. And I wanted to show you all kind of the range of poetry. So I'm gonna start off with a poem that was written when I was kind of exiting high school and going into college, and I was missing my hometown very much. It's called Wait. But my hometown is heavy. Keeps my heart grounded, never question why I walk with asphalt on my soles. I'm just marking my journey. Here I go. Yo me llamo Haydil. Translation, please. My name is Haydil. Emphasize the Y for my father's campesino tongue, Haydil. Misspelled on my birth certificate, my mother's fingertips can't speak English. Consonants have a way of assimilating. I've been called Haydil ever since the sunset on my first day of kindergarten. And you'll see Haydil waving X's casting shadows because below the X lie the jewels. According to the pirate movies, the BX, that's the spot. B as in to exist, X the intersection of survival and riches. The Bronx is translated to living treasure, wealth that breathes. Imagine that. Ironically, I've been taking wooden boats during full moons to an island too far to be considered home, in search of misplaced gold lost in between pages of the Middle Passage. My ancestors, they ask, what is home when your bloodline declares you're a migrant? The first time I was told my existence was nestled in the way I say the Bronx, the short pause, the weight of the R. I murmured it for weeks. For one day I'll exist till all, no longer warm, thin, breathe it, thin, think it, thin, think, thin, thick. Home is thick, gyrates around your pulse. I'm never ashamed of saying I grew up in the Melrose Projects on 153rd, running up narrow stairways, running towards mommy's kitchen, repeating, never stop running, but remember to run back. The Bronx is never silent, never timid, always running, always fierce. The Bronx is heavy. This poem is
Oh, that was
called,
great.
thank you. I was gonna read another poem that I wrote actually while I was still, I believe I was like 17, 18 years old. So this is a praise poem and it's called Alabanza. Praise the fiery cardinal rising past your windowsill on Tuesday mornings before the sun wakes. Praise the clutter of the 2 train riding uptown, the kickety rack racks of metals colliding, kickety rack racks making music, kickety racks. Praise yesterday, dreamt of the nights you would slide underneath your parents' covers, listen to your father snore, monstrous noises escaping his gullet, imagined it to be Pandora's box, releasing demons amalgamated with leftovers. Lay in your college dormitory, miss your father's way of inhaling the world, then meticulously exhaling his own version. Praise the scholastic books you got in the 2nd grade. Those bubbly Bibles of printed parables convert even housing projects into magic tree houses. The dim-lit hallways were caves, the mission a way through. Praise your mother's voice, the orchestra station in her throat, applying mascara by the bathroom sink, singing Ana Gabriel under her breath. Praise the imagined fiery cardinal swooping by your window, backlit by reaching red rays. Praise your grandfather's heartbeat, the way it hammers onto his chest 66 times per minute. Praise your fingers, their promised diabetic gene, their jittery dance, the way they coalesce when your thoughts surpass their speed limit. Praise the calluses they await and the words coming out of them. Praise your Metro card, the guarantee of an adventure with a promise to find home. Praise the spirit nestled in your hair. Praise your little sister's eyes. Those two moons got lost in his back pockets. Praise you, praising these reflections of living. Praise those gates you call ribs, extracting and lung knocking with every breath. Praise these breaths.
Wow.
Thank
That
you.
was great too.
Thank you so much. I have one last poem if you'd like to hear it.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, this is the poem I was referencing. It's a little more grim and a little darker. But this one is called What You Won't Do Is Paint Over Our Dead. And it's the homage poem for Rest in Peace murals in the city. On the street corner, bark meets gravel. Near strands of pixie sticks, orange tips, names the grass, snow, dragon, blow, fairy, coats of lead running from brick walls, scattered on they back, the black of black. Ever question why luz pura agua de sol is afraid of permanence here? For the warriors who die on patrolled corners, whose feet once combust to the cadence of the conga, bloom to the sounds of the sirens, the way street warriors die on these empty, bottled, barren corners, night lights dictating their triggers, been running for centuries yet remain here, inked in the alleyways of his ribs and epitaph, guerreros are born steel from sweet rivers, honeyed bones, scorn their prayers, yet pray for them, claim care for them. In the name of warriors who flee on forgotten corners, I sit by a pixelated mosaic atomic bomb mural ticking on a gentrified Northeast Philly organic coffee shop back entry stoop, thirsty for the end. For the warriors who rise from the dead on chipping brick walls, you set a mantle where you stood. We made altars for your spirits, pour libations on your death days. For the warriors who dream worlds on these street corners, we've been dying with you all along. They've been dying with you all along. Been dying with you all for mad long.
Wow. I can't even find the words to speak. Uh, thank you so much for those three readings. That was beautiful. Is there anything else you want to say, like where people can find your work or anything similar to that before we close out?
Yeah, I don't have an official website just yet, but you can find some of my poetry if you Google Haydil Henriquez. And I guess the last thing I like to share is keep writing, keep expressing yourself, never silence your voice, allow it to reign in all of the spaces that you inhabit, um, and never be afraid to tell your story.
All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Ethan. Have a great one.